welcome. I'm Catherine Donato. I am a professor in the School of Foreign Service at the Institute for the Migration. And I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague and collaborator, Amanda Carrico. Amanda and I met when we were both at Vanderbilt, and we started working with some physical scientists on Bangladesh and the environmental drivers of out-migration in Bangladesh. And that project was funded by the Department of Defense, by ONR, as well as in several rounds now, National Science Foundation. So we continue the work. We've been collecting more data. Amanda, I'm sure will give you all sorts of insights about the project. But I just want to say it's been my pleasure to work with Amanda. She does amazing scholarship, both on this project and in other spaces. She's at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Department of Environmental Studies. I know, I for many years got that wrong, and I said sciences, but it's studies. So please help me welcome her, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the warm welcome, and it's really been enjoyable to learn about Earth Commons and all the great things that are happening here. And it feels like it's a growing institution. So I look forward to meeting more of you the next several hours. As Catherine mentioned, we've collaborated for over 10 years now. A lot of our work together has been situated in Bangladesh, which I'll talk about a bit today. And we've had a heavy focus on the relationship between climate change and migration. And I will say a little bit about some of the data we've been collecting about migration, what we've learned there. But I want to focus my comments today on some analyses that are trying to explore the experiences women have, especially in South Asia. I've got a couple data sets, if I have time, that I'll talk about, including Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. But trying to understand how women and girls are sort of uniquely affected by climate stress, and then hopefully some of the considerations we might take away from that as we think about sort of policy and practice and kind of how to move forward considering these challenges. But as Catherine said, I'm a professor of environmental studies at University of Colorado Boulder. I run a research group called the Environment and Behavior Lab. I'm trained as a behavioral scientist. My background is in the field of environmental psychology. Do a lot now with environmental demography work. I've really kind of loved using and working with demographic data. But a lot of my work is really interested in sort of behavioral dimensions and behavioral responses to environmental change. And so one of those threads has been trying to understand how our values and attitudes and perceptions are driving our behaviors as they impact the environment. I've done some work in the Colorado context looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and also national parks and land management in that area. We have a lot of wild space in Colorado. But the work I'll talk about with you today is considering how the behavioral dimensions of adaptation to climate stress. And so as I mentioned, we're focusing a lot in this work on migration, but I've also been looking at sort of risk reduction actions at the household and individual level, fire risk reduction, and other forms of adaptation behavior. And so the conversation about gender will sort of integrate in with some of the ways that individuals and families are trying to cope and respond to climate stress. So, I think this is a conversation that's being had. Of course, I'm sure we're all familiar with some of the discourse around the need to consider gender and the unique vulnerabilities of girls and women in response to climate stress. What we know is that, and we were already seeing, is that climate change has the potential and is deepening poverty and exacerbating existing power imbalances, sort of where there is research scarcity and where there are sort of human rights concerns, we're at risk of those being intensified. But that, of course, can affect both males and females, right? We see differentiated impacts, the social roles that we occupy and the gender norms that exist in society are sort of conditioning how we experience climate change and also how we respond to those stresses. And so what we know is, for example, that males who are often more likely to work outdoors, exposed to heat, exposed to pollution, they tend to have higher rates of occupational health risk, they have higher rates of suicide, more exposed to things like kidney disease in relation to water quality stresses, armed conflict, very kind of gendered and unique differentiated risks that males experience. And we see some, kind of corresponding patterns for women. Females are at higher risk of malnutrition. They're at higher risk of death in response to a lot of disaster impacts. And of course, there's risks of maternal mortality and domestic violence and so on. And so what I'd like to argue is that there's a need for disaggregated data. There's a need to explore how climate change is affecting societies by looking at the unique experiences and the roles that males and females hold within our society. And that's what I'll try to do today, is try to zoom in on the experiences of women and girls. I'm thinking about the kinds of the ways that climate change is interfacing with these gender roles and social norms. So I want to start with more of a promising story. The Millennium Development Goals were released in the year 2000 with 2 of the 6 goals and several other targets pushing the global community to address significant disparities in the health and well-being of women and girls. And this includes targets to improve access to maternal health, family planning services, as well as attempting to close gender gaps related to education, to economic opportunity, to labor force participation, and to decision-making. And the good news is that we've seen a lot of progress in the last now 24 years since these goals were introduced. This is showing you some data about primary school attendance throughout the world, I believe. And the top line is showing you the gains in the percent of girls attending primary school, such that we're extremely close today in achieving parity between girls and boys in primary school attendance. This is a nearly 20% increase in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So really promising trends. If we look at the share of women in government, especially due to some pretty muscular policies to require and encourage women to participate in leadership, we see a near 15% increase in women participation in government since the year 2000, gains in all regions around the world. And then this is showing you some improvements in maternal mortality. You're seeing a pretty strong declining trend in the risk of a woman dying due to childbirth, declining by over 35% since 2000. Some regions, such as South Asia, which was where we're working, have cut the risk of a woman dying in childbirth by more than half. So really tremendous progress in this area as well. So lots of signs of encouragement, lots to, I think, to celebrate as a global community, thinking about the kind of rights and opportunities that women experience. But there's a sort of open and important question about the extent to which climate change could be slowing some of these trends, impeding those trends, or potentially reversing some of these recent trends. And so this is sort of a motivation for the work I'll be talking about today. So I'd like to touch on 3 different sort of analyses that come from 2 different projects. I'll spend most of the time today talking about some of the work we've been doing, looking at the conditions and timing of marriage, which, marriage is not the thing we think about when we think about climate change, but I'll show you some data to suggest that, in fact, it might be quite related to the environmental conditions that we're experiencing, and is a very sort of pivotal and defining moment for all people, but especially for girls and young women in many parts of the world. And then I'll switch our attention to talking a little bit about climate change and migration, but especially the experiences of women who are often remaining behind in their communities of origin while their husbands or partners or other male household members move into urban destinations to look for work. And then finally, if we have some time, I'll talk a little bit about some of our work looking at on-farm agricultural adaptations and some interesting gendered kind of relationships there. So let's talk about marriage first. So we've seen another, I'd say, promising trend that we've seen in many parts of the world is an increase in the average age of a woman's marriage. So if you look at this graph, this is showing you the trend in South Asia. In the 80s, about 65% of all women, all females, married before their 18th birthday. So a substantial proportion of those married even before their 16th birthday. So these are girls marrying at very young ages, but you can see that it's declined pretty sharply, such that we're now looking at about 1/3 of females in South Asia marrying before 18 and 20% or so marrying before the age of 15, or maybe that's 16. So with the rise of sort of educational opportunities, with shifting gender norms, with greater workforce participation, alleviation of poverty, we're seeing kind of some of these norms change, and the economic conditions that encourages very early marriage are changing as well. but it remains somewhat common, especially in rural settings in different parts of the world, with, as I said, about 20% of girls marrying before the age of 18 and 5% before the age 15 in South Asia. The consequences of early marriage, I think, are important to consider. There's a lot of concerns about the opportunities that a female would experience in her life when she marries at very young ages. It's associated with disrupted education. Most girls leave school when they marry because they're beginning to adopt kind of adult roles and responsibilities and to become a caregiver in the family. They experience lower earning potential over the course of their life, of course, linked back to the reduction of education. A woman is likely to have more numerous childbirths and more rapid childbirths over the course of her life if she marries much younger. And this puts her, as well as the child, at risk. She's at a higher risk of maternal mortality, and the child is at a higher risk. And you're seeing some of these indicators of the child's well-being on the left here. Higher risk of stunting, of infant mortality, of being underweight, of experiencing various kinds of diseases. So there's lots of concerns here. Now, how is climate change linked to these kind of conditions that are leading to early marriage, right? I mean, we know this, we've known this for a very long time, that poverty is the biggest predictor of a girl marrying before 18 or age 15. We think of 18 as the cutoff for early marriage, and 15 is generally the cutoff for what we call very early marriage, a very, very young marriage. And we know poverty is the sort of driving factor here for a lot of families who might be struggling to meet the consumption demands of the household, and in conditions where the social norms are such that a girl will relocate and join her husband's household after marriage. There's an incentive to move daughters outside of the home so as to reduce the cost of caring for the family. And when conditions are especially stressed, you know, when you've had maybe a heat wave or a drought that's affected agricultural yields in a given season, and economically a family is dealing with a bit more of a scarce situation, one theory is that the motivations might be increased to try to move her out of the home, and there may be a desire or a plan to try to use marriage as an abrupt or short-term coping mechanism. This also intersects with sort of dowries and the cultural customs of how marriages are organized and the financial transactions that occur with them. In the context of South Asia, now Bangladesh we tend to see dowries a little bit less than what we tend to see in many parts of India, but they still are common. And so the woman's family is going to, offer a financial gift to the husband's family. As a girl ages, her marriage prospects start to decline a little bit. It's attractive and it costs less for the woman's family to marry her off at a bit of a younger age. And so if a family is experiencing this accumulation of environmental and financial stress over time, it tends to lead to families marrying their daughters at younger ages overall. There's also some really interesting work that's come out in the last 5 to 7 years about how experiencing disasters is threatening the reputational risks of young girls. So in Bangladesh, especially, where we have very frequent cyclones, and people are encouraged to move out of their homes and move to a cyclone shelter. These are really crowded areas. There's very little privacy. There's not a lot of gender segregation in a culture that, when more conservative members of the culture prioritize segregating by gender, and those families feel this perception that their daughters are their reputations are being put at risk, and her marriage prospects might be damaged because of her sort of interacting with young males. And so you actually see families talking about wanting to marry their daughters shortly after cyclones because they've had that really sort of complex experience in those cyclone shelters. But there's another way to think about this as well. And there's actually data suggesting that in some cases, environmental stressors are actually associated with reductions of marriage at certain ages. I'm showing you some results from Corno et al., who looked at age of marriage and weather shocks in the Indian context. And they actually found a reduction in the risk of marriage for younger girls during periods of drought. And their logic here was, well, families are paying a dowry, right? Marriages are expensive. And if in that year you've seen a loss of your financial resources, perhaps families might want to actually delay a marriage, avoid it for that year so as to conserve those resources. And of course, it's very likely that these kind of relationships vary across context and in different kinds of livelihood and socioeconomic conditions. All right, so let me show you the data that we have. So Catherine mentioned we've been working on a project together for about 10 years now. It's called the Bangladesh Environment and Migration Survey. We call it the BEMS. We have a really fantastic team that sort of evolved and morphed over the years, but this is the sort of most recent instantiation of that. And so what we've been doing is collecting data primarily in the southwestern region of the country, very environmentally vulnerable region, hazard prone. Lots of cyclones are kind of funneling up the Bay of Bengal into this little sort of pocket where India and Bangladesh meet, and also high rates of flooding and salinity. And so we have randomly selected about 6,000 households in 30 communities throughout that region. And because one of our goals is to study migration, which is a relatively rare thing, a lot of people migrate over their lifetimes, but in any given year of their life, you know, the risk of you migrating is pretty small. So we sampled 200 households in each of these communities so we can really understand sort of patterns of migration over time. We interview household heads and spouses, so the head female and the head male of the household. And we prioritize in those interviews the collection of retrospective information. So we ask people about the births and deaths that have occurred in the household over time, marriages, livelihood activities over time. Of course, we're asking about migration trips family members have taken. And there's a long, long list that I'm not covering. It's a very comprehensive survey instrument with a lot of really interesting data. And so I like to put this up just to give a sense of like how we structure our data and integrate in the environmental indicators with it. We use a demographic technique of trying to sort of reconstruct the life history of an individual in our sample. And so this is what we call a person year file. Every row in this data file is a year in the life of an individual, okay? In this case, we're looking at the life of a young male that we interviewed in 2018. I think there's a year cut off here at the bottom. But you can see that this person was born in 1993. We know that from those vital statistics we collected. We gathered livelihood information. So we know that they entered the workforce at age 13 in 2006. This often corresponds with leaving education. Worked as a fisherman for several years and then took their first migration trip to Dhaka to work as a rickshaw puller at the age of 16 in 2009. They came back 5-6 years later in 2014 and got married in that same year. And then you can see they went on to start having children and a family. And so it's just really rich, interesting information to kind of see lives unfold in front of you in numbers, which as a scientist, that's like, oh, the numbers part is really fun. But it also, this method also allows us to then integrate information about the environmental and economic conditions of a given place at a given time. And that's what we're doing on the right-hand side of this data set. This particular data frame is showing you we've brought in information about heat waves. On the left, WSDI, and then cyclones, and those were sort of the conditions in the year of that community. So with this data structure, what I'll be showing you is a series of hazard models where we're predicting the probability of a woman, a girl or a woman, marrying in a given year of her life, considering the environmental conditions she was facing at that time. So I'm looking here at a subset of our data. The women in this sample were the household heads or the spouses in 9 communities of our data set. And we're really focusing here on the effect of heat waves and of dry spells, particularly because we know that they have strong relationships to agricultural yields in the region. Let me just skip past this. So let's see, what do we find here? So here's the model. And so we've included several controls. I won't talk about those, but we're controlling for time and for place, the educational attainment of the woman, the religion of the household, her age. And what we see is when we look at the effect of heat waves, and I'll just say that's going to be my focus here because it is across all so many models that we run, heat consistently emerges as the most powerful predictor of the kinds of demographic processes that we're looking at. And here you can see that we're looking at on the x-axis here, the duration of heat days. This is the number of consecutive days where the daily high temperature was above the 90th percentile. Okay, so we can see as that heat wave intensity or the duration exceeds about 18 days in duration, the risk of her marrying that year begins to increase more exponentially, such that in the most intense heat wave periods, 24 to 30 days, she's about at twice the risk of marrying that year relative to unaffected years. We also see a similar relationship if we lag heat. One question we had is like, how quick are these kinds of responses? If marriage is a coping mechanism, is it being pursued over the next 24 months, or are people trying to organize marriages relatively quickly? That links to a question I'll be asking later about the kind of conditions of her marriage after the fact. And so here we can see that if we lag heat waves, if we're looking at the risk of her marrying the year after a heat wave, we still see a positive relationship, but it's not quite as strong, right? And so that leads us to think that these are more contemporaneous processes, that families are likely organizing those marriages relatively quickly after those heat wave impacts are occurring. Finally, in this model, we're trying to look at the conditional effects of heat waves across different ages. So of all the women in this sample, they're between ages 11 and 23. And now I've disaggregated by women who are over the age of 18, those 15 to 17, and those at very young ages of 11 to 14. And we can see here that it's actually the relatively older, they're not old, right? But relatively older women who are more likely to marry during periods of heat. So a woman at 18 and over is about twice as likely to get married during a period of intense heat wave compared to unaffected years. Our younger girls, a positive story here is that their marriage risk is just less linked to climate stress. But there is an inflection point, as you can see, as we move to about 18 to 24 days in duration of a heat wave, we start to see this kind of uptick in the risk that she marries. So, and these are obviously not as strong, but still positive trends in those curves. And so for young girls, 11 to 14 years old, during very intense heat waves, a girl is about a 14% risk of marrying compared to unaffected years at 7%. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's the mechanism of marriage in this case? So is there any volition that the individual getting married has, or is this entirely arranged?
I think it varies. In rural areas, the predominant scenario will be an arranged marriage, and arranged marriages can have varying levels of participation of the two parties. And so you're probably going to see the woman's involvement quite a bit less, and perhaps more often you'll see marriages where she actively doesn't want to get married, but is still being sort of asked to do that. Yeah. So, but very much, I mean, in this context, which is rural, much more sort of culturally traditional, these are overwhelmingly arranged marriages. Yeah. Yeah. And please jump in with other questions if you have things. I should have said that. So that was one analysis looking at a relatively small subset of our data. We've since, as Catherine mentioned, there are several phases of this project. In 2019, we expanded this research to an additional 20 communities. And so we had the opportunity to explore these effects further, but also to probe them a little bit more deeply. And here what we're doing is trying to disaggregate across different livelihood strategies. Is this a coping mechanism among individuals who are especially vulnerable to climate risk because of their participation in the agricultural sector? That's sort of the theory we've adopted. And we see evidence to suggest this. So right now I'm showing you on the y-axis the risk of a girl marrying under the age of 15. These are girls under the age of 15, the risk of them marrying in a given year. And in gray here, you're seeing families that are working outside of agriculture. And you can see there's just no variability across heat wave intensity groups. Her risk is pretty much equivalent across. But when we look at families that are engaged in agriculture, you see that's where we're seeing this uptick in risk. It's families in agriculture experiencing severe heat waves that my sort of understanding from being in these contexts is likely have tried other strategies to adapt to these risks and are facing very, very difficult financial circumstances and are resorting to this as a way to manage the stress on their families. Okay, now let me turn our attention to this question of like, okay, if families are pursuing marriages under these conditions, how is this affecting the conditions of that marriage, the marriage dynamics? You know, are the kinds of marriages that a family is organizing, as we've just discussed, sort of different under these circumstances where the family is pursuing this out of stress rather than out of sort of more carefully intended processes? And so in this analysis, I'm looking at 3 outcome variables that help us understand the conditions of that marriage. One is the wealth of the family at the time of the survey. So this would be around 2015. The husband's education level at the time of the survey, and the husband's acceptance of intimate partner violence, again, at the time of the survey. We included some questions that ask about whether both the female and the male think it's acceptable to hit their spouse under certain conditions. And we're sort of using that as a little bit of a way to understand that husband's gender values or gender norms. And the key variable we're using here as a predictor is the intensity of heat waves in the past in the year of her marriage. And so we do see a relationship. We see, and again, we're controlling for some other variables here, but that when a girl was married in more intense heat wave periods, she's likely to have married into a home essentially that has less financial resources. And also marrying a husband who has lower levels of education. So, it takes time and resources and work to sort of organize a good marriage for a daughter. And then this is again suggesting that these are marriages that are probably arranged in haste with, different sets of motivations, and that might well be compromising the well-being of the woman as she enters into that family's home. We do not see a relationship between heat waves and gender values. We do a little bit with drought. We see that girls that marry during drought-affected years, their husbands have slightly higher acceptance of intimate partner violence, but we don't see that effect show up with heat. Yes, please. Husband and wife. Yeah, it's a good question. I used to have this on the top of my head, and I'm going to ballpark a little bit, but I believe the average age of marriage for a male would be about 25 to 28. And for a female is like 17 in this particular sample, 10 years or so, yeah.
Is the husband usually a little bit younger or a little bit older?
Very good question. We haven't actually run that analysis, but it's a good question. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't have an answer. Qualitatively, I can tell you from reading the qualitative literature and having some discussions, my prediction would be it would be older. So like a little bit less desirable. I mean, when the husband's family is less desirable for a marriage, then they would request generally a lower dowry, or the expectations would be a bit lower. And so that's why I would expect that, but it's a good question, yeah. Any other questions now at this point? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you just say a bit about the independent variable and what it looks like? So it's the duration of the heat waves, the duration of heat waves during that year.
Right.
And is it like every year typically has about the same, except there are a few big spikes? Or...
No, yeah, so this is, oh, sorry, yeah. I can show you the distribution. Bear with me here. There it is there. So this is the number of consecutive days that exceeded the 90th percentile over the climate normal. So we're looking back at the typical distribution of temperatures at the annual level from 1960 to 1990. And we're asking, like, are days exceeding that 90th percentile of that threshold and the number of consecutive days that are doing so. So you can see it's getting much hotter, right? There's no question. And this is each of those lines is a community's values, and then the bold line in the center is the average. And so it's also getting a bit more variable over time as well. So most of our very hot years are in the last 10 years, as you can see. So one question, and we had this conversation over breakfast, is the ability to tease apart these kind of time-related trends that might be linked to economies, linked to policy, linked to just, social change over time from those that are specifically linked to climate. And that is a challenge, right? And not something we can do with perfect precision, but, we can sort of see the relationships in the data. Does that answer your question there? Yeah. Okay. So I'll turn my attention now to talk a little bit about migration, but are there any other questions about marriage? Actually, this is a perfect time for other questions. Okay. So So let's talk about climate migration and how this affects women's well-being. So this has been the primary focus of our project. We've done a lot of different analyses trying to understand how patterns and processes of migration are changing over time in general, but also how those patterns, those changes might be in some cases linked to climate stress. And again, we see heat as sort of a driving factor here. It is continually the biggest predictor of migration. This is again the same measure of heat wave duration. This is in a larger sample of the data, but you can see that the risk of a male household member making a first migration trip is approximately linearly related to the duration of those heat waves. And if I was to disaggregate again by agriculture, you'd see very different curves where this is predominantly driven by families that are engaged in agriculture. Most of these trips are to Dhaka or another large city, and they're most of the time an individual male who's leaving the family, going into the city to work, and will likely return in 1 to 5 years to rejoin the family's household. So they're sort of males moving away and then coming back with the female family members, and in some cases, the older males remaining back in the household. We actually see a declining risk of migration to international destinations. So one of the patterns we see when we look at climate-related moves is they tend to be to shorter distance destinations, primarily internal, and are less likely to go across borders. It's just very complicated, right, to cross borders and can be expensive and risky. And so we seem to be this kind of like diverging patterns of migration because of that. So when we've asked the question, like, who are the people moving? One interesting question in terms of the sort of demographic processes we're studying is there something about climate that's changing the selectivity of migration? We know that people who leave communities are quite different than the people who remain behind. But climate change is a different kind of stressor, right? And so is what we know about selectivity of migration changing? And so this analysis is attempting to try to like tease that out a little bit. What I've done is a pretty simple analysis where on the right-hand side, I'm looking at the characteristics of migrants who left during heat-affected years, and on the left-hand column, those who left during unaffected years, quote unquote, controlling for other kinds of stressors here as well. And so one of the things we can say about the climate migrants, bit of scare quotes there because, you know, climate's complicated, but the people who are leaving during these very hot periods tend to be relatively older. They're more likely to be married, and they tend to have more children remaining behind in the household. So whereas migration, you tend to see individuals who are less attached, maybe less likely to have children. In conditions of climate migration, people are leaving the home when they have more responsibilities in that home. So it raises important questions about how those families are doing who are remaining behind. We again see that the climate migrants are disproportionately engaged in agriculture. They're also sending less money back to families. So they're, you know, my sense from talking to people who have had these experiences is that it is very much adaptive. They're finding work and destinations. They're able to fill gaps that the agriculture isn't able to produce in these very hot years, but they're not earning as much as what someone who's leaving in unaffected years is earning, and they're not sending nearly as much back home. So one of my graduate students, Samina Islam, has been doing both qualitative and quantitative work to really try to understand the conditions of women who remain behind. 2 summers ago, she interviewed about 30 women whose husbands were on a migration trip at that time. And she found that many remain behind women are enjoying some benefits. It's quite a heterogeneous experience. And so a real challenge here will be try to explain some of that heterogeneity. Many women talked about feeling a greater sense of agency. They were running homes in some cases. They were the key decision maker. They were the household head in those cases. And so that was sort of pressuring some of the traditional gender norms. It's kind of changing some household and community dynamics in very interesting ways. And many women talked about, you know, enjoying that experience. Whereas others found it to be a very kind of exhausting and burdensome experience. One really interesting quality is if the in-laws were still in the home. That seemed to matter a lot. So if your mom-in-law is there, then you have a very different experience. And then if you're not, so we can leave that for later, but that was an important factor there. I just said that. Remittances are, of course, a key source of income, and the families whose husbands have migrated away are often receiving more remittances, and they're investing those back into education, into resources, into the house, and other sorts of things. But one thing that did show up more quantitatively than qualitatively is the sort of unique vulnerability that remain behind women face in response to natural hazards in that origin community. And so if you look at this figure here on the left-hand side, I'm not sure if you can see, whoops, wrong way. No, I don't have a mouse, but on the left-hand side, you're seeing the self-reported health of women who have not experienced recent storms, and you can see remain behind women have slightly higher self-reported health. But when women have experienced several rounds of storm impacts, their self-reported health is substantially lower than comparable women whose husbands have not remained behind. And the stories we were hearing is just, again, like related back to gender norms about a woman's ability to kind of move freely through a community, to participate in the community's sort of rebuilding process, to lobby or sort of advocate for the resources that she and her family needs. Many women experience higher barriers than males would in those circumstances, and you can see it's sort of translating in many cases to a sort of, you know, lower health outcomes in general. So finally, let's see. It's 10:10. Yeah, so I'll just talk about this last sort of story here about women's experiences, and then I'll wrap up and we can have more questions if you'd like. In a final data set, we've had the opportunity to look at what's happening in terms of adaptation when people stay, when they're not leaving, especially when they're able to remain in agriculture, even during these periods of extreme stress. And so for about 5 years, I had the opportunity to collaborate in a project in Sri Lanka where we were looking at on-farm adaptations in response to water scarcity. Here in Sri Lanka, the main drivers are shifts in the monsoon pattern that's causing sort of a late onset of monsoons and extending the dry period, and really stressing the major sort of rice growing season of the country. And so over the course of these years, we looked at a lot of different on-farm strategies that were being recommended by government and NGOs as a way to kind of manage these interruptions in water supply. This includes some kind of indigenous practices of sort of growing rice in nurseries and using different kinds of rice planting techniques on the left, and then more sort of modern, I'd say, techniques like system of rice intensification and other kinds of water conserving irrigation methods. And so we asked male and female farmers, and these are the people who are responsible for the farming decisions, like the head farmer, if they were aware of these different adaptation practices. And we hear consistently, well, I should say this, among those who are aware, we find that women are consistently more likely to adopt many of these practices. It's quite interesting. And women adopting sort of, you know, environmentally significant behaviors tends to be a little bit higher in regions around the world. It's quite interesting, and exactly why we're not sure. But what was important was that women were substantially less likely to know about these things, right? So when they knew, they were adopting, they were innovating, they were trying, but the awareness gap was really what was driving overall lower rates of women's adoption across these techniques. And so kind of looking at why, you start to see some patterns, like how is information flowing through communities related to agricultural adaptations? Predominantly, it flows through farmer organizations and different kinds of community organizations that tend to be quite male dominated. And so women who we talk to discuss going to these meetings, but feeling relatively isolated, not being kind of brought into conversations, and in some cases being very sort of like explicitly sort of rejected from participating. And so another example of how sort of being very attentive to the way we're deploying adaptation policy in practice is really critical for ensuring that you know, all people are getting access to these kinds of techniques. There we go. Yeah. So where do we go from here? I don't have great answers, unfortunately. I did the analysis, and now you guys go figure it out. No, but no, I think I hope these data at least shine a light on the need to really consider gender, and to really use data as a driving sort of force to think about how we need to make adjustments or develop new policies and practices. It can manifest in very sort of subtle and nuanced ways how gender disparities play out. And I think sometimes the rhetoric around gender and climate has been criticized for being you know, exaggerating certain kinds of differences and oversimplifying those trends. And I think that's fair criticism. There's really kind of, again, subtle ways by which gender can manifest, and being careful and thinking through that and looking at the data, I hope can help us sort of think through next steps. So I'll leave it there. I think I'm out of time, but I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Methodological questions. Randall Kuhn, who was at UC Boulder.
He was, yeah.
So he runs big intergenerational survey, and I was wondering if you were able to use some of that, or would it make sense?
Yeah.
I think they have really good data on like harvest.
They do, yeah, the from MATLAB, yeah. It's not integrated into anything you saw today, and I haven't directly used those data, but Jane Menken, who is a key figure in that project, and I are co-advising a student now, and she's beginning to look at fertility preferences in relation to climate. And I think that's a great example of where those data, I think there's a lot in that data set. And we have used it as ways to kind of understand our own data and to think about methodology. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, our study area is very different. The environmental conditions are very different. And it could help us both to bring a longer time period, but also to think more about spatial generalizability as well. So yeah, it's a great question. Good suggestion. Mhm. Sure.
I was wondering how your team relates to qualitative work. I saw something.
Yeah.
Get at these mechanisms, and then also the question of political participation. If you can say a word about your work in Colorado as well. My impression is that, for instance, climate activism in the US is much more, women are much more
Engaged in that, yeah. Qualitative work, we use mixed methods. You can see the project, I'd say, privileges the quantitative. Its main goal is to generate those quantitative results, and we put a lot of resources into doing that, but we certainly do use qualitative. We've used it at multiple stages of the project, both in the project development phase. We've used it in the middle, in the kind of midstream, to kind of understand what's happening in the field. And then we've used it a lot after we see quantitative results to kind of, you know, sort of cross-check, validate, and also understand, like you said, mechanisms and processes. So I'd say all of my students have at least one chapter in their dissertation that's a qualitative chapter. And I'm not personally trained as a qualitative researcher, and so it's not something I tend to be doing myself all that much, but we've seen an extraordinary value of that. So, and then the political participation, maybe you can say a little more about the question.
The team found out women's political participation somehow, if the survey included that. I mean, we saw the picture of the farmer organization.
Yeah, we know that about the case of Sri Lanka. We have women's participation, and they are, I'd say, on average more engaged than males, but I'd say that they're, I mean, we see that in the data, but I'd say that the type of engagement is different for some of those reasons. And it varies a lot over the kind of community as well. Some of these communities have very centrally managed irrigation systems that are sort of being affected by the gender mainstreaming policies, and you see much more sort of like systematic participation of women in that way. And the more traditional communities that are outside of the kind of government controlled irrigation management, you know, they vary. Some are very more kind of patriarchal and traditional, and others have just had, you know, different kinds of leadership. So there's a lot of, you know, these are heterogeneous places, but in general, I think women's participation is challenging. They're doing it for sure, but it's hard to be taken as seriously, I'd say, as the males are. Yeah. Thanks. Please.
I wanted to ask about heat versus water and storms in Bangladesh. So most of what we hear, I think, about climate change in Bangladesh is about storms,
Flooding.
low-lying areas, salinification of water sources. And so it's a little surprising that like your key independent variables are all about heat. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about why that's the case. Is it that heat really is the sort of what you see as the primary driver here, or is it that it's the measurement issue makes it more, I don't know, easier to incorporate into these analyses or something else?
Yeah, I think probably a bit of both. So we have looked at flooding. We have indicators of rainfall. We have the ability to look at flood scale from other data sets, including remotely sensed data and like MDAT data and things like that. We have incorporated flooding into a lot of models, and it really just doesn't tend to predict migration all that well. You see a little bit of drop in migration in some cases of very large floods. But my sense is that's probably like just kind of a short term, it's just hard to move around. And so, yeah, it might be impeding migration in some periods, but the effects are small and pretty unreliable. Salinity, I think, is probably a very big factor, and it is hard to pick up on. So I do think that you're probably seeing some omitted variable sort of patterns related to salinity. It's a slowly evolving thing. It kind of accumulates over time. The places we're studying have been experiencing higher salinity stress, but it's not the kind of thing we could see really on like an annualized time scale. So that I think that fits your point about like what can we measure and what are we measuring? But so for heat, right? So is this just kind of an artifact of what we have measured? I don't think so, actually. And I can say that because in the agricultural models that have access to, again, larger data, longer time series data, and also more environmental measures, they also tend to see heat as being a major driver of agricultural output. And we were talking over breakfast about, 2-3 years ago, I was presenting results like this in Bangladesh, talking about heat stress, and I got a lot of just sort of dismissive sort of reactions to it, like, it's hot here, we know it's hot. People know how to live with heat, like heat stress isn't a thing. It's not, I think you're on the wrong track here. And I was having these questions like, okay, maybe what's going on here? And then when I was back in Bangladesh in this past summer, there is now a national commission to study the effects of heat waves. There's an occupational health sort of panel that's been brought together, and there's now a Bangla word for heat waves. And so it's just sort of arrived on the radar in a new sort of way. And I think because of the numbers you just saw, the last 5 to 7 years, there's been really intense heat waves, and it is beginning to really stress families. And I think there's sort of like a new language developing because of it. So hopefully that gives.
We have a paper, a recent publication looking at erosion and the first migrant trip, international and internal. And we see a very strong relationship there. So, could it be water that's affecting erosion? Absolutely. And the story there is pretty strong, but it's again, not directly measuring water. It's, consequence of all the water and the river channel.
Yeah. I mean, that's really helpful in both regards. I guess, the challenges you already said is if the heat wave, if the measure of heat wave intensity is just kind of gradually going up over time, then it's really hard to sort out.
Right.
Plausibly a causal effect here. And I guess I wonder if you did have other data on water salinification, cyclone susceptibility, like whether it would help you get a little bit closer to a tight causal. I'm not obsessed with causal identification, but it does seem like you might want to try to get a little bit closer. And if you had like sort of heterogeneity within your villages, among your villages, in sort of susceptibility to certain kinds of natural disasters, and you see the storm comes and you can see different patterns based on, say, sort of how vulnerable your survey locations are from the places that are flooding. Maybe that would help.
Yeah, I think you're right. I didn't speak to storms and cyclones. The storms and cyclones were included in all the models I showed you as a control, and they do affect the same outcomes. We see higher early marriage after cyclones and storms as well. For the sake of time, I didn't kind of dig into those data. They're not quite as strong as the heat effects, but they're there. But you're right. And I think we're going to need to expand geographically to be able to accomplish what you're describing. And so we are working with other data sets as an attempt to do that. Yeah. So no results quite yet, but I think you're right. I think you're on you make an important point.
We have some new funding that's collecting longitudinal data going back to just 1,500 households, but generally remember these are retrospective data. So doing what you suggest, I think would require longitudinal household data as well, so we can make these observations before and after. And we might be able to do it with retrospective, but not as well. I just wanted to.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I think I saw a couple hands and yeah.
Thank you for sharing with us. I was wondering about the potential to see some of the trends that you're noticing in Bangladesh and Southeast Asia, and how we may or may not see those trends in other regions. Looking at, for example, South America also experiencing increased heat, but having a different culture. And so how much of, but also an agricultural based society. So
Yeah.
like you have different marriage culture, but same industry of agriculture, same climate problem of heat. Is there potential to see similar trends, or do you think culture has enough of an impact that would deviate?
I think culture has a very large impact. Yeah. Especially with less with migration. The migration's a, cross-cultural phenomenon. Of course, it might look a little different ages and different, kinds of livelihood activities pursued and different family structures. But I think migration as a coping response is something we have seen throughout the world. The specific relationships and what's driving migration and drought, there seems to be more drought-driven migration coming out of Latin America, and in South Asia and Central Asia, it tends to be more heat related. But beyond that, I think we're seeing similar processes. Marriage, though, I do think is highly culturally dominated, right? I mean, this is an available response because of the kind of histories of marriage and what marriage means culturally and gender norms. And of course, the economic kind of context as well. So I would not expect to see marriage pursued as an adaptation strategy like this and in other parts of the world. I think most parts of the world have had histories like this, and they've changed at different rates and for different reasons around the world. So we may have seen this in Europe and, different periods of time, but I think it's a very kind of locally, culturally defined sort of adaptation response. Yeah. I think I had one down here and then I'll.
Thank you. Because I was wondering whether you have seen intersections with climate change, evolving infection disease prevalence, and gender in your research.
Okay, sorry, I didn't quite hear. Let me see if I can look at the chat.
It's a effective relationship of climate change and infectious disease.
Infectious disease. Oh, in this particular region. Okay, I mean, I've read some of that literature. I'm not doing that work. The relationship that I'm most aware of is the relationship between mosquito-borne diseases and climate risk, especially dengue fever. And I've been there through a few outbreaks, and so it's like very memorable. And I would imagine that we're seeing similar relationships as we see throughout kind of tropical and subtropical regions, but I can't really speak too specifically to that. Yeah, but it's a good question. I think, yeah, certainly part of the stress story of these places for sure. Yeah.
Say anything about the pilot work we're doing?
Yeah, we are beginning to look at heat stress and infant mortality. And so a very new project, and we're also using larger data sets to try to get to tease out some of those confounds that you're describing. And so that's sort of an emergent project, and that's the first we're really looking. I mean, we looked at health a little bit, as you've seen, but that will be a larger focus on these health outcomes. So yeah.
That relationship between like rates of maternal mortality and marriage trends.
Yeah, we do see higher maternal mortality in younger girls who marry. We haven't looked at it in this data set, but that's a pretty well-established relationship that we've seen in other data sets. We can't, it might be difficult in this one because of the, maybe, yeah. I would think it still holds. I mean, of course, maternal mortality has declined a lot, and a lot of the most intense heat periods are more recent. So actually, it's a very good question, like how, the extent to which the more contemporary risk that young girls are facing is translating into maternal mortality, given that access to health has improved quite a bit. So yeah, you raise a good question. Yeah. there another question? Okay.
I'll explain.
Wonderful. Sure.
You don't
Go
mind?
for it. Fire away.
How far is Dhaka? And like from the places in your.
How are you traveling?
No, no, sorry. From the places that you're doing the survey. And like how easy and difficult is it for people to go back and forth? And I just,
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if your survey covers other kinds of reasons for migration and their interplay here. So there's
Yeah.
also lots of migration, I think, to Dhaka for employment in manufacturing industries for women in particular. And
Yes.
for men in maybe construction kinds of employment. And I don't know if you've captured that and tried to think about how that is disrupted or exacerbated or amplified.
Yeah.
Through changes in the climate.
Yeah, very good questions. Yeah. So Dhaka is like sort of like right here, if I get to it. Like as the crow flies, it's not far at all. I don't know, 90 miles or something.
Yeah.
Maybe. It's been very difficult to get to because of the road infrastructure and the very large river right in the center of the country. Bangladesh just built its first bridge over what's there called the Padma River. And so it's substantially easier to get to Dhaka now than it ever has been. And that's just within the last 2 years. So how that changes migration dynamics is a very good and interesting question. And that's one of the motivations for us collecting some longitudinal data. But I think, so the question about other forms of migration, we capture all migration in this. So we're really just capturing, we're asking questions about when you've moved, where you went, and trying to document all of those moves if possible. We do ask people about the purpose of their move. And for males, it's 95% of the time for economic reasons. And that's surely the purpose. I think I have no reason to sort of question that. But I think the important question is, what are the conditions that led them to need to move for economic reasons? And those are, in some cases, linked back to the environmental conditions. So we don't rely on purpose of trip to classify migrations as climate related or environmental related. What we're just simply looking at is like sort of variability in rates of migration over time, vis-a-vis their exposure to these climate stressors. Any given migration, could you say it's climate migration or not? I don't think so. I mean, we're going to have to figure out a way policy-wise, because if we want to, provide services and access, we're going to have to figure something out. But in terms of just basic data, it's not really something we could do. There'd always be a lot of error around that. So, yeah, it's a puzzle, but I think I'm out of time. So
Well,
thank you so much.
again. Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
And I just want to remind everyone, so next week we have an eco talk unveiling African rainforest composition and vulnerability to global change. And the following week we have sustainability in the era of AI. So please put those on your calendars. Thank you, everyone.